Well, hello and welcome to this summary presentation of digital transformation with the ePerspectives digital enterprise method and framework. I'm Arsalan Rad. In a previous session, we did a more detailed presentation about the framework, and this is a shorter summarized presentation. We looked at we drew the parallel with the paradigm shift we had when we went from the in the world of electronics from analog to digital. We looked at the old way of doing things in the analog way, when similar to organizations today, things are basically all over the place, too many connections. It's very hard to trace things. It's very hard to locate things, and very hard to apply changes. And then we talked about this paradigm shift where we moved to the digital world with IC electronic circuits, where we have a blueprint, we have a circuit diagram. It is traceable and it's componentized very importantly. So we can essentially remove a functionality, as I mentioned before. For example, we want better amplification. We have a componentized part called amplifier, and it has some interfaces, its legs that it gets inserted into the circuit with. So if we take that out and replace it by an amplifier which is stronger, as long as it respects the interfaces and maintains them, and we can reinsert it the same way, then the rest of the ecosystem will follow seamlessly, but with better amplification. So we talked about this is what we want to achieve in businesses similarly, without getting into details, use it to your imagination. They have a similar kind of way to the old way of analog circuits. In fact, maybe not even that great, many traditional organizations. So we looked at a method and framework that uses that paradigm for us, that actually componentizes things and makes them interface based, and doesn't basically go all over the place, and it's more traceable, and we can locate things and we can replace them and improve them. So we looked at the digital enterprise method and framework ePerspectives. We talked about it having 3 key perspectives of business, enterprise, and change. Each one of them have a bunch of things that they do internally, but we don't, from the outside in view, we don't look at what they do internally. We only look at the output that they provide to the outside world, hence the point of interaction, similar to a componentized IC circuit that we showed earlier, right? So in this case, we have different perspectives with the different components inside of them that we actually black box. So we talked about this. Nobody needs to know what's going on inside strategy formulation, for example, or business operations definition, except those who are involved internally with it. This way, we save the rest of the organization for having to get involved or learn or be confused by a bunch of terminology they're not familiar with. Basically, this is only the output and the input that is focused, so it becomes encapsulated into strategy formulation. And it makes the input to what we call a strategic capability model, which is the high-level view of the capabilities that the business needs to have in place in order to provide the services or the interactions or the perception to the outside world that it wants to do. So we looked at these perspectives of business, enterprise, and change, the key perspectives, which are supported with the 2 support perspectives of enterprise planning and operations. Looking at business perspective, we look at business strategy, which is essentially about what we want to be and do with respect to the outside world, how we want the outside world to perceive us, what are the interactions, and thereby we will find out what are the key services or key strategic capabilities that we need to have in place. The next is business design. Now we know what the business wants to do and what it has set itself out to achieve. Now we're going to define and design a business operating model, the processes, the organization largely that will support us in order to achieve what the business set itself out to do. And importantly, we mentioned that the business perspective, whatever we do in it, is agnostic to implementation and deployment. So everything is business focused, and it is later in the enterprise perspective when we start looking at making what the business perspective defined implemented and implementable and deployable with as an enterprise. So we look at aspects such as enterprise IT and technology, as well as organization and resourcing that we need to have in place to satisfy the business needs. And then we look at the change perspective that starts by applying change planning first to establish a sound foundation instead of jumping into development, and we all know what happens there. And then based on that sound foundation, we define we implement our change. We talked about what goes inside of everything. So in business strategy, we talked about strategy development methods or frameworks, Lean, TQM, ESAT, Six Sigma, and all that stuff. And we said that a lot of strategy houses do this work, but unfortunately, in most organizations, there's no channel between this going downstream. So there's the rest of the organization, business design, or especially enterprise design and change, they normally cannot feed off this strategy because they are in different words of abstractions. So we talked about also techniques that make it a little bit more tangible, such as business canvas modeling and MIT's X matrix, which relates to strategic capability primarily to KPIs, but also to strategic objectives as well as values. And we then mentioned that all this will be black box, and the only thing that is important is how the input from all this goes to the strategic capability model, which essentially baselines our strategy. This is where we have our high-level capabilities, but also mapped into KPIs and strategic values. So every capability from now on will have a business strategic value. Then going to business design, we talked about activities we do, such as business operations modeling, business process modeling, organization modeling, and also so we do process decomposition, service decomposition, and so on. We looked at value stream mapping into customer journeys, so essentially making sure that the customer journey is very much aligned with the best way, optimized way we execute the process, and most importantly, it is perceived the optimal or the best way by the outside world, for example, by our clients. This is black boxed, and as said before, we have what is called a business capability model that starts first from a strategic capability model by default, and now starts evolving by feeding off all that business operation definition that we have now black boxed. So all that knowledge that we find out will be extracted and encapsulated into a business capability model, which is really the crystallization of our business architecture. And I define architecture as the balancing act of fitting what we do, accommodating what we do by the best fitting structure. And that applies across the board in buildings or IT solutions, or even for human sciences, I would argue. So what we do to be supported by the best structure, that is process-driven approach, not structure-driven approach. So process drives, structure has to adjust and accommodate. So a business capability model encapsulates our business operating model for us, our way of doing things, our processes and services, as well as our organization. Basically, a BCM is the high-level view of our future organization model. So once this has been iteratively developed and stabilized, we have the business capability model in place. And next, we look at the enterprise IT perspective. Enterprise perspective, that in which we not only look at those IT and technology aspect as well as organization location, which per se the IT has data, app, and technology, and organization we look at people and resourcing and such. But also we have, as mentioned, through the link that we have to the business perspective, we can have a view of the business and everything that is defined. And then we will also have a link to the change portfolio to be able to, for everything we do, make a relation into what are we currently doing or what may have been planned to be done that will touch upon, that involves what we want to do currently with a given item. So then they are all black boxed. And we talked about the enterprise capability model as the single most important artifact across everything we do. So that also starts by default by a business capability model, but as I mentioned, business capability model is implementation agnostic, and now in the enterprise capability model, we make that implemented and deployed. So how do we do that? By making sure to profile every capability and design and relate or link it however you want to do it with these key aspects of IT and technology and organization, but as well its business value, business importance, as well as its change impact. So in here we talked about doing an exercise which is heat mapping, look at every capability, assess it from all the different aspects, optimize it, and then devise eventually a way that a subset of this that gives us that heat map version that you see becomes input to the next perspective. So the heat map version gives us sort of the essential idea about what roadmap based on what priorities and constraints we want to devise, and you can argue that the change capability model becomes a subset of that heat map ECM where we have defined the changes and priorities to apply. We talked about in change planning that change capability model will be interacting with capability-driven solutioning and capability-driven planning in order to solidify this change planning, sub-perspective. And we highlighted the importance of capability-driven in both solutioning as well as planning, so that we have mutual integrity in place. We don't do work packets that are just chunks of work that may have chunks of work that actually are in common. So I do something, you do something, but unaware of what we are doing. Then I go and buy something, define some new services, etc. And you do the same thing, and you can imagine the cost of this in terms of legacy and everything else that mushrooms after that. So we will have detailed sessions on capability-driven planning and solutioning, because this is very important. And then finally, once we have this, we have a very solid foundation to do change implementation. And we broke change into the key categories of when we have to add and enhance and innovate, or when we have to keep and maintain what we have. But we mentioned what is most challenging is when we want to improve and rationalize what we have. So at the same time, improve it. So that is while maintaining part of it, and that warrants normally a multi-speed approach that we will cover later. Everything gets black box as mentioned. So the only thing that is relevant, so if anybody with it whose work is behind one of these boxes will do nothing of his or her science, will expose nothing of his or her science to anywhere else, except if there's a perspective, if there's an artifact that depends on it. So for example, you can argue that people who are involved with business operations definitions, they will be, that is a second blue box. They are only concerned with the activities that finally solidifies and provides the right input into the business capability model. They will, as you see, they don't have any link in it to any other part of the organization. This is how we shield everybody else from having to be bothered by stuff from the outside, from the others that don't really matter too much to them. This is what we call separation of concerns or encapsulation. And we refer to this XCM, which has 4 evolutionary stages of SCM, strategic capability model, BCM, business capability model, ECM, enterprise capability model, and CCM, change capability model. We refer to this as the golden thread. This is the only part that needs to be known by people whose role and function goes across the wide range of enterprise. So COOs, CIOs, heads of portfolios, CEOs, these are the roles typically, CFOs, these are the typically roles that need overall oversight, and in order to achieve that, they only need access to the XCM. They don't need to go and ask about all the other artifacts behind any black box. And in fact, if it's really important to have access to any of those internal artifacts, it can be achieved directly from the XCM. We can have access directly through the XCM instead of just bringing those artifacts separately. Now, we looked at the enterprise capability model. As mentioned, this is the single most important artifact, which goes across everything we do. So enterprise capability model, we talked about the 360-degree profiling of every business capability. So we use, for example, an example like invoicing. And we looked at invoicing, saying, okay, so from this, we can look at the capability called invoicing in the center. And then we can ask questions such as, okay, show me all the services. What are the services involved with you? And then through the business strategy link, we can say, okay, so show me the business value for these services and in fact for this capability. So I know its business importance to business. We can then look at its organizational aspects and say, okay, so what are the people, organization, which locations are working with invoicing, which ones are external people, which ones are internal, who works in IT, who works in business and such, what locations. We look at every capability, the technology and the IT aspects. So for invoicing, what packages, what applications do we have with one vendors? What is our view of these vendors? What kind of contract length do we have with these vendors? Every sort of detail in that sphere. And last but not least is for this given capability invoicing, if you're going to change anything about it, we better find out where in the world, so through the 4+1, in what part of the organization, what geography are we doing anything with invoicing, any projects that touch upon changing invoicing, and if so, what applications and technology are they touching about? What vendors are they dealing with? Have they been successful? Has the internal review or external review of those vendors been a good one? And one of the most important links, obviously, what is the business value of this thing that you asked me to do with invoicing? What is how important is it from a business point of view? And this gives us a 360-degree analysis, which gives us possibility to do what if scenario analysis and do fact-based analysis and decision making. So no more meetings of umpteen different entities or people from different backgrounds sitting and polishing their PowerPoints and saying things that not the other people would necessarily understand or relate to very well, but everything will be business case, driven by business case and actual facts. And as you see here, this can be done by tools. I mentioned that the method and framework are promoted by one of the global enterprise architecture and business modeling tool leaders, Software AG, which are the second biggest software company after SAP from Germany. And this method and framework has in fact been highly recommended and implemented by the tool, as you see, and successfully executed in key strategic initiatives. So this is a quick view of the XCM in Excel. So you can see on the left, on the light blue, you can see that is the distillation of the business strategy sub-perspective. We capture their strategic capabilities, and through that left side matrix that you see is how we derive their strategic value. Then the darker blue gives us the business capability model. So forget the smaller columns because they're all for planning and estimation and monitoring, but we kept it here just the same so you get an idea. But the main thing is the business capabilities, and as you see, they are given a strategic value. So we can from now on measure them. Now, the same capabilities make the default for the middle part, which is the enterprise capability model, the orange-brown section. So we start with the same capabilities and decompose them a couple of levels more. And as I mentioned, you see here the two aspects of enterprise IT, that is app, technology, and data, as well as organization and planning and resourcing. So for every capability, we profile it from these aspects, but also from the left, we are linked to business, so we can measure business value, and from the right we're linked into change planning. So the green part is the change planning. As mentioned, we define a change as baseline plus delta, so whenever there is a change, we have to first look at the business strategy, strategic capability model, where is there an impact, what changes there, then when we ripple it into the business capability model and define and delimit the changes there, and the same thing bringing it to the enterprise capability model through heat mapping, and finally we define what needs to be changed. That goes to the green part with the change perspective. We have very thorough sessions and presentations about this and how we actually use XCM, and we will use a real live example, real end-to-end case from the world of telecommunications, so that this becomes much more tangible. So the key characteristics to summarize for ePerspectives are that it has one unified baseline language and terminology that everybody can understand. Outside that, then people might have their own specific language and terminology, but as you recall, that goes into only their own black box. So the outside world does not need to know them as long as they can distill their science into the output that it's supposed to provide. And that helps us have this minimized number of documents and artifacts, because we have only one XCM, as mentioned, one XCM document. That is an amazing achievement, that we have only one enterprise artifact, which is called an XCM. So we have one XCM, one artifact, central artifact, and the rest are internal artifacts that people will work on it by themselves and provide an input into the XCM where it's relevant. We talked about separation of concerns, that we don't let anybody who's not working with our perspective to have to know about it, hence the analogy that we drew with componentized world, with the electronic world, that you can replace a component because it's black boxed, and that is achieved through this separation of the outside in view versus the inside out. So the internal versus the external, and we keep saying the same thing. Anything that is internal to a perspective, nobody else needs to be bothered by it or find out about it, except for the output that it provides to the components and entities that are dependent on it. And that output is uniformly defined and very clear, so that makes things a lot easier, and we have high degree of cohesion because we have perspectives, roles that are only doing things that are relevant for their given perspective. You don't have IT people discussing business or program planning and such. And we have low coupling, as you mentioned, because we have minimized number of links. In fact, we have this XCM as the only golden thread, and normally we don't have more than one link to worry about. And the framework has been very successfully, in its earlier versions even, used in key strategic digital transformation or overall transformation initiatives. It has given great results, so it's not like many theoretic frameworks like TOGAF and such that are really good reading, but are hardly a guide that to actually follow, to actually go from A to Z. But this framework really has worked greatly in a number of key strategic initiatives and provided real tangible results that have been noticed very much by the business and by the impact it brings to that. So hopefully you will find out as you start using the framework that it's one that is more intuitive, that has got to do with human analogies, how we solve problems rather than tedious technology or architectural methods. Hopefully it will provide the right result for you if you start using it. On that note, I would like to thank you for your time. Look forward to the next sessions. Thank you.